Hello, families. Welcome to the Homeschool Bunch Podcast. Today we are meeting with Jamie Erickson from Unlikely Homeschool. Be sure to like, click, and subscribe, and then segue into the interview.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maisha here with the Homeschool Bunch Podcast. We are happy to have Jamie Erickson of Unlikely Homeschool here with us today. Thank you, Jamie, for joining us. We truly appreciate you coming on with us today, and we look forward to hearing all about your journey in homeschooling. So let's get started. So can you share your journey into homeschooling and how it has evolved over the 16 years of educating your 5 children?
Yeah, so I was a trained teacher in the classroom, and I was married to a former homeschooler who was homeschooled back in the 80s and 90s when it was super weird. I never thought I'd homeschool. In fact, I remember before getting married, my mother-in-law, my future mother-in-law, pulled me aside and she asked me if I would ever consider homeschooling my children someday. And I kind of laughed in her face and said, absolutely not. Who even does that? You know, those are obviously famous last words,
Yes.
but it was not on my radar. I assumed because I had an education degree and was making steps to be in the classroom, that the classroom really was the perfect gig for a mom. I knew I'd have the same vacation days as my kids. I'd have comparable hours, work hours to their school day. They could come into my school with me. It just seemed like on paper, being in a traditional classroom and having my kids there with me was the right way. And it wasn't until I had my first baby, and I remember very distinctly the doctor handing me a little pink bundle and looking down at her face and thinking, I know how many hours that the kids I teach are away from their parents. And I know that I send them out the door each day, out of my classroom, sort of bedraggled. You know, they kind of walk out of the classroom looking like a drowned cat because it's been such a day. They've learned all the things, said all the words, done all the fun activities. And then I send them home, and it was like their parents were getting the leftovers. And as I stared at this little pink bundle, even then I was cognizant of the idea that I didn't want that for her. And by golly, I didn't want that for me. I was selfish enough to say, I love this little human person so much, I didn't want to miss out on a single moment. And so really, we got started homeschooling for that simple reason. I didn't want to miss a moment. And since that time, in 16 years, obviously, my reasons for continuing have evolved and changed. That initial why or answer to the why question has remained the same. I feel like homeschooling has really afforded me moments with my kids that I would have missed out on. But now if you were to ask me, you know, Jamie, why do you homeschool? I can give you a litany of reasons, but it all started with that one thing. I just wanted moments and I didn't want to miss them.
I love that. And I understand where you come from. I got started later with my son in homeschooling, and I would say a prayer, you know, every day before I dropped him off, you know, please let him have a good day. Please let him listen to the teachers. Please let him sit, you know, still in his chair. And then some days I would just cry, you know, dropping him off, because you never know what it's going to be one day to the next. So you don't know what experiences you're going to have. So I definitely resonate with that as well. Yeah. So as a homeschooling parent and an educator with experience in both traditional and homeschooling, what insights or unique perspectives do you bring to the education of your own children?
Well, I can tell you I'm a different homeschooler today than I was in those early years. You know, when I was in the classroom, I really got to see the underbelly of the educational system, both the good and unfortunately the bad. And I knew as I started homeschooling, I knew I really wanted a different outcome for my kids, but I was conditioned to believe that education could only look a certain way. You know, they had to sit in a desk. We had to have like a classroom space. We had to use textbooks and fill out worksheets, and it had to happen from 9 to, 2:45, or it didn't count. And I wanted a different outcome, but I was following the same map. And you can understand where the disconnect is.
Yes.
And so I really had to unmoor myself from what I thought education looked like. And really looking back, my definition of what I thought education wasn't really education. It was school. And there's a difference. I had defined it as education, but it really was just school. It was a structure and a format that actually is very helpful and good and right over there in a brick and mortar situation where you kind of have to have certain foundational structures in place to sort of corral a herd of children and get them to learn together. Those are all good and right there, but they're kind of unnecessary. And I would go so far as to say constrictive in a home environment. And so the first few years, I was like going against the grain and experiencing the fallout of that. And by year 3, I think I really started to untangle myself from some of those school structures and then began to see education for what it really was, just a continuous building of the mind, continually pouring into this deep well of a child. And I became much more relaxed. I learned to trust myself more. I learned to teach to the child that I had, not the child the textbook told me I was supposed to have. And I think I definitely allowed a lot of non-quantifiable things to count. You know, it may not, the learning may not have checked certain boxes or been something I could put a percentage grade and mark with my red pen, but there was still learning happened. And I trusted myself to allow it to count.
So how long did it take you to get to that point?
I think it was probably year 3. And I think now in the ministry that I have and, speaking with thousands of homeschool moms all across the world, really, I would say that year 3 mark is such a pivotal mark. I think by in your first year of homeschooling, you often have like the deer in the headlights look because you're inundated with lots of ideas, new words, even curriculum suggestions, lots of people's advice. You're just kind of trying to survive that first year. By year 2, you kind of get your sea legs under you, but you still have lots of questions. You're starting to pivot and you're starting to become your own singular homeschool. And by year 3, I feel like most homeschoolers, at least that I've talked to, kind of exhale. And they begin to own the homeschool that they have and really begin to enjoy it.
Yes. And that's something that I found when I talked to some of my parents who are looking to get into homeschool. They think that they have to go by this system, by this book. And they inundate themselves with the workbooks and, the lesson plans and this and that. And my kid is having these meltdowns. Your kid is experiencing the same thing they experienced when they were in school. You're just teaching them things from a piece of copy paper, And like you said, you have to kind of teach to your child. So that's something that's really, I think with most homeschool parents, that's something that we don't really do. We don't teach to our child. We teach to a curriculum that was probably created by someone who is still in the school system. Right. So I definitely find that very, very helpful as well.
And I would say to what you just said, in the same way that it takes a mom about 3 years to sort of begin homeschooling at a real comfortable, easy clip, it's going to take your kids almost that long too, especially if you're pulling them out of the structured traditional, public school way. You have to learn how to homeschool, but so do they. And you have to give them the grace and the long enough leash to be able to feel comfortable with it. And I hope that's encouraging to a mom or a dad who is listening. Oftentimes it's in that first year where, and I forget the statistics on it, but it's something like 30%, something like that. 30% of parents who begin homeschooling quit after their first year because they haven't done it long enough to see the small wins yet and to feel comfortable in it. So if you are one of those parents that really feels like you're drowning and you're questioning whether you can continue, whether you're doing it, quote unquote, right, and you're not really seeing many gains in your day, just keep persevering and keep pushing through to get to that sweet spot.
Definitely. And when a parent who feels like they're drowning, I'm sure you felt that way, in your journey. How important was community to you in homeschooling?
Absolutely important. Yes. When I first started, my daughter was in kindergarten. She was 5, of course, and 4 or 5. I had 3 babies at the time. Like, I had 3 kids in training pants and diapers along with her. And I felt like I was drowning. I felt like, one more big wave was going to be the final thing that pushed me under. And I looked around and reached for 2 different kinds of women. I needed women who were in a similar stage as me to have that like solidarity, women who got it, who were drowning in diapers too, who were, new to this thing and were making kind of the same mistakes as I was, because that feels comforting to know, hey, I'm not in this by myself. But I also needed to look for those veteran homeschool moms who were just even a few years further down the journey that had a little bit of experience and some words of wisdom and certainly some encouragement to offer, and even the fruit of their labors to show like this is what it can look like, in the end. I needed those women too. They maybe were homeschooling in the early years at a different time than I was. And certainly the landscape of homeschooling has changed significantly since when I started. So these veteran moms, their early years experience may have looked a little bit different from mine, but I still needed their wisdom and I needed their encouragement. So I really did look for 2 different women, 2 different types of women when I was first starting out. And to be honest, I still look for those women. I still need them.
Yeah, and they need you. So thank you for, creating these platforms for them. So that brings us to your podcast, Mom to Mom. So it reaches a global audience. How do you navigate the diverse needs and challenges of mothers from different cultures and backgrounds in your discussions and give them advice?
Well, I think it goes back to the idea that the struggles that mothers have are kind of universal. The mother in Minnesota is struggling with the same struggles as the mother in Central America. There's universal themes to mothering. We all share similar fears about our children. We all have similar dreams and hopes for our children. And of course, my podcast is a faith-based podcast. I'm a Christian homeschooling mother, first and foremost. And so really my faith undergirds so much of everything that I share. And so for the most part, the listeners who are tuning in share that same common belief system and worldview. And so we have that in common.
Good. I love that. And so speaking that you are faith-based, one thing I've noticed with a lot of people that we work with in California, we receive state funds for homeschooling. What are your thoughts on not being able to receive state funds if you do a faith-based curriculum?
Right. We have similar legislation here in the state of Minnesota where I'm from. And I think it really depends. I kind of lean heavily on not taking state funds simply because now hear me, I realize that some people can homeschool only if those funds are available. So it really is a case by case basis. But when at all possible, I advocate for not taking state funds because in taking public funding, you are allowing the public's opinion to dictate what you teach your child, when you teach your child, how you teach your child. And I would venture to guess that most parents choose to homeschool because they want to decide. And so, again, it's case by case basis, but I guess I lean more towards, if at all possible, to pay for your curriculum yourself and pass on the state funds. And this is coming from a person who, listen, in the early years, my bank account was so empty, it had an echo. And so I really had to lean heavily on my public library in order to provide some learning for my child, because that's what I had available to me.
That is so important. So I feel I'm a library aficionado, and I love libraries. We have a really amazing library out here, and I try to have our kids in our program go to it, but also I go almost every week. So a lot of people don't know how important the library is to the homeschooling journey.
And really what the library offers for free, we often think of just books, and that's definitely a perk. I mean, I can probably tell you very confidently, my kids have read maybe $1 million worth of books in their years of homeschooling that I didn't have to pay for because it was free. And really and truly, if you have curiosity and you have a library card, there's very little you can't learn.
I love that. That's so true. Okay, so could you also share some practical tips for homeschooling parents who may be facing doubt or challenges in trusting their abilities and in trusting God throughout the homeschooling journey?
Yeah, I always lean heavily, and again, I'm a faith-based homeschooler, so that's where I'll aim. I always lean pretty heavily on Philippians 1:6, and I'll just share it for your listeners. And it reads, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." And what that tells me is, one, I know that God loves my kids way more than I ever could. So I have all these grandiose plans for them. And I think I know what is best for them. And in some ways I do. But he knows what is so much better for them, and definitely loves them and is advocating for them and is for them so much more than I. And so the good work he started in them, he's going to see it through. And I just have to trust and take him at his word and know that it's not by accident that he gave them to me. And for sure, I can tell you, I have lots of faults and failures, and there are many, many things that I do not know and therefore cannot pass on to my children. But I know that it wasn't by accident I was called to homeschool these children. And so what I have to offer, it's like 5 little loaves and 2 little fish. I know that if I just hold it out to God to use for his good purposes, he will multiply it, and it will be not just enough. It'll be more than enough for what my kids need. And I was just thinking about this. It's interesting that you should ask that. Today is my daughter's 20th birthday.
Yeah, I saw
and
your post.
I was reflecting on her early years in homeschooling and how much I really doubted myself and how I thought I was failing her because I had all these little ones. I mean, it was like raining babies in my house, really. That's what it felt like. And I just thought I was failing her because I didn't have enough. I didn't have enough. I didn't feel like I was enough. I didn't have enough time, enough arms, enough attention, enough capacity. Yeah, energy, time, money, whatever, to homeschool well. But she learned so much in those early years. Her character grew in ways that it wouldn't have grown in those early years. And so I really look at some of the struggles that we faced, like she had to grow her patience. Yeah. When I had to deal with a crying baby. She had to grow her forgiveness when, her little hurricane hands brother came and ruined her project that she had spent hours working on. She had to learn all of these things that matter just as much in homeschooling as 1 + 2.
Yeah. And I'm assuming it's like a 4-year gap between her and the youngest, the other kid.
Well, I went on to have another baby. So there's an 8-year spread between my 5, but the first 4 were 5 and under. And we had a lot of diapers happening in our home during those years. And it felt like a circus of my own making. But man, those were the best years. And I didn't even know it when I was in them.
I love that. And so raising and launching 5 kids along the shores of Lake Superior, have you guys always been in Minnesota?
We have always been in Minnesota. Our time here next to the shores of Lake Superior is a relatively new development. We've been here for about 5 years.
Okay. So how does your location impact the homeschooling experience? And what role does the natural environment play in your children's education?
Well, I have often said that if I lived anywhere else besides Minnesota, I would be a year-round schooler, or what I would call a Sabbath schooler, where we would take 6 weeks on school and 1 week off throughout the whole year, because it just helps with retention. It helps with my energy resources or lack of. It just seems like that's the best way to do it. But I live in a state that has summer for about 2 seconds. And I don't want to miss a single second of it. So I don't want to be homeschooling in the summer. Also with that, if I wanted to do like a nature study project, it's real hard to do that when it's like negative 20 degrees outside. So I have learned to homeschool in the place I'm in. And that means a lot of times our biology projects, our nature study has to happen in the summer. We can't do it in the winter. And other than some nature study, I do pretty much no school in the summer. We read books. I read aloud to my kids. We still have some faith practices that we do every morning together. But other than that, like, we're not whipping out the math textbook in the middle of summer. No. I would have no longevity with homeschooling. I would have given it up a long time ago had I had to do it in the summer. So that really does, it really does demand of us a particular schedule because of the place that we live.
Okay, you said you do the Sabbath, 6 weeks on, 1 week off?
I would do it if I didn't live in Minnesota. And I guess I hope that a mom who is listening to me hears this when I say all that. You can go online on social media and see a mom doing homeschooling a particular way. Mm-hmm. But please recognize she's doing that because it works for not just her. It works for her kids. It works for her budget. It works for her husband's work schedule. And sometimes it works for the state that she's in because of the weather that they have. So I go online and see these moms doing wonderful nature studies in the middle of the school year. And if I wasn't
nice.
Yes, it must be nice. Good for them. But then I also have to turn around and recognize I can't do that. And that's okay.
Okay. And you have to know what's going to work for you and what isn't going to work for you. Yep. So I love that you kind of tailor your education based on what works for your family, your location, and what you guys have planned. I want to discuss, I hear you're an author, and having authored books like Holy Hige.
It's Huga.
Holy Huga. Okay.
I know it's not spelled anywhere close to that, but that's how you say it.
Holy Huga and Homeschool Bravely. How do you incorporate principles of creating a welcoming environment and building confidence into your homeschooling journey and teachings?
Well, I think that environment is synonymous with the word atmosphere. And I think atmosphere is less about what you have on your walls. I know, when you go to social media, you see the beautiful learning spaces and the homeschool rooms, and that is wonderful, but it's not necessary. And I would actually argue that atmosphere incorporates all 5 senses. So if I'm wanting to create a learning atmosphere, I want my kids not just to see, an educational poster on a wall. I want them to be introduced and exposed to ideas and concepts. I want them to hear music playing in the background that really brings an element of peace and calm and not chaos. It might even mean I am putting an essential oil in the air that smells good because, by golly, my wet dog sitting here next to the school table doesn't smell very good. So I feel like we all are kind of conditioned to believe that a learning atmosphere has to look a certain way. But I think atmosphere goes so much deeper, and it really incorporates all the senses. It really has more to do with welcoming curiosity to the space, strewing, and that's a word you'll hear sometimes in homeschooling circles, but strewing or sprinkling interesting items around your house that would lead to questions, lead to curiosity, lead to exploration. I really think that's more of what it means to have an atmosphere of learning in your home.
I love that. And so when you're homeschooling your children, do you have experience with like neurodivergent children or autism? Have you had any experience with that?
Well, I have one son who has dyslexia as well as a neurological condition. I've never said publicly what it is because that's his story to tell. And it really has, I write about it a little bit in my book. It really has been quite a journey for him. And he was the child where we started. I was like secretly thinking, how in the world am I going to homeschool this child?
Yes.
But you know what? I have seen over the years the amount of perseverance that he has had to exhibit. What would have come easy to one child, it has been doubly hard for him. And he has stuck with it, and he has risen to the occasion. And interestingly enough, he's actually on a path to enter the Navy as a Navy SEAL.
Okay.
And I can't think of a single thing that would have set him up better for that career path than perseverance and having to work doubly harder than everybody. So I can see how even in those quote unquote struggles, the thing that maybe I was thinking, how are we ever going to do this? That was exactly what that child needed to do the thing God had for him someday.
And do you ever find yourself thinking like, what if they would have attended, public school or private school? Do you ever find yourself almost thinking like, what would turn out like? Like, does that kind of occupy your mind sometimes?
I would be lying if I said it didn't. I think that's the easy place for our minds to go to, like the what if. Would it have been better over there? And I guess all I can say to that is because of my experience in the classroom and having some neurodivergent kids in my classroom, I would say that the struggles would still be there. Like he would still have his neurological struggles. He would still be dyslexic over there. But all of the sort of social caste system that the public school sort of sets up would only amplify other struggles in his life. But having him here at home, he didn't have to worry about some of those social situations that would make him grow up faster than he needed to, or think he was uncool when he liked, X, Y, or Z. He wouldn't have to worry about the sneaker that everybody had. All of that social caste system of the public school, I have seen, only amplifies the struggles in other ways.
That's so true. And like feeling like you have to keep up,
right,
with this person and that person. And one thing that I have noticed, I'm sure you've noticed with your children as well, is that they're their own person. They think for themselves. They can hold conversations with anybody of any age. That's something I noticed with my kid. And that's something that I really value with him. And then when he meets other people, they're like, how old is your kid? How is he like this? And so do you ever find that when people meet your kids, they're just like amazed? Do you find like that wow factor?
Well, we often hear the age-old argument of like, what about socialization, the S word? But if you think about the real definition of socialization, it means that you are able to interact with people of all stripes, with all ages. And there's no other time in our lives where we will ever be divided up simply by the year that we were born. That's not true socialization. That is forced association. And so, yes, I see not just my homeschooled kids, but, the kids of my homeschooled friends, they're able to interact with people of all ages. They're able to articulate their thoughts and feelings. My two oldest have now done college courses. My one is a sophomore in college. My other is a freshman, or doing dual enrollment as a freshman college student. And one thing they both have said is, Mom, if you can just follow basic general outline, like the expectations of the teacher, and articulate your thoughts about something, you're going to get an A in the class. And I think homeschoolers can do that well. They can follow directions and they can communicate and articulate their ideas and opinions. And so I think they do really well in real social situations. Now, does that mean that you won't stumble upon a weird homeschooled kid? Nope. There are weird kids in homeschooling, but I can tell you there are weird kids in the public school too. I think it's more about nature than nurture. There are kids who are introverts and extroverts in both the homeschool and the public school system. There are weird kids. There are socially awkward. There are socially graced. I don't think it's homeschooling that makes them that way. I think that's just their personality. And I would argue that, again, that social hierarchy of the public school sometimes exacerbates their awkwardness or their discomfort because it doesn't allow them to actually socialize in actual social ways.
That's true. And you talked earlier about community, that you needed to find community for yourself when you first got started. But also when it comes to socialization, how important do you feel it is for parents to really go out there and develop the community for their kids, like going to enrichment programs or even creating their own groups?
Well, when we moved to this new area 5 years ago, I went looking for a homeschool co-op because we had been a part of one since my daughter was in preschool. It started out just like a preschool and play group, and it just so happened we all continued on and wanted to homeschool. Well, most of us did. So for 12 years, we had been a part of a homeschool group of sorts. And when I moved to this town, I went looking for a community, and there just wasn't one. And I thought, well, if I am going to have a vibrant community, both for me and for my kids, I might have to build it from the ground up.
If you build it,
but here's the thing. Whatever need I feel, I know someone else is feeling. So if I feel needful of friends, if I feel needful of community, other people do too. And I might just have to be the one to be brave enough and say, hey, you want to come over and get something started? And so I did. I took to Facebook, and I was literally brand new to this town. I had just arrived, and I just said, here I am. I want to start a co-op with like-minded parents. This is how I want it to look. And that first year we had, I think, 23 families. Right now, that group, it's been going for 5 years. We have 39 families with a waiting list of 28 families. Because we all need community, both for ourselves and our kids. And one thing that's important to me is when my kids go to youth group at our church, youth group can be cliquey, you know? And so kids gather together from various schools around, and they have their people. I wanted my kids to have their people too. And so that really was where that was formed. You know, they can go to co-op and have their people.
I love that. And so I want to segue into this. You've been married to your sweetheart for about 20 years now. And how has your partnership influenced your homeschooling journey?
Well, we have the unique situation in that he was homeschooled. So I can tell you in the early years when I felt like I wanted to homeschool, he was adamantly against it.
Really?
He was homeschooled in a time, first of all, he lived in a very small town, and it was very isolating just because it was small. But then he was homeschooling in a time where homeschooling was unheard of. You know, his mother had the truant officer called on her because it just wasn't being done. And she really was a pioneer in homeschooling. But what that did to her son was it made him feel like an outsider all the time. And he really struggled with outsider syndrome. And so as we approached the years where our child, was going to have to be schooled in some form or fashion, he really struggled to be on board with homeschooling. But he agreed to let me do it for that first year in preschool, thinking, well, you can't really screw up preschool. You're just going to sit here and do colors and shapes and sing songs. So it's fine. So I thought of that as like my in. Okay, I'm going to do preschool. And one day it just so happened he providentially was sick and had to come home early from work. And he laid on the couch as my daughter and I were doing our preschool, and we were just singing songs and reading books and doing a craft. But he saw how much she loved it and how much we were growing close together as mother and daughter and what that was doing for our relationship. And he also began to see that the landscape of homeschooling had grown and changed exponentially. And homeschool wasn't the same as it was back in the 80s and 90s, and that there really was opportunities galore for anybody to jump into any of their passions and to be able to form community. And now, if you were to ask him, he's one of the biggest homeschooling advocates there is. But to your question, so I say all that to say, I have a little bit of an advantage in that, he lived this. He knows the ins and outs. He's seen the underbelly. He knows how the sausage is made with homeschooling. The things that I have to remember are two things. One, I have to remember that he still nurtures his own fears about our kids and about their education. So often as moms, we have fears, but we have to remember that they have fears too. And when they bring their fears to us, like, oh, honey, little Johnny is 7 and he's not reading. Should we do something about that? Mm-hmm. We have to validate that and listen to them and not take it as an offense and not feel like it's an accusation against us. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is I had to determine that, as moms, we're really great about saying, I'm the mom that my kid needs. I'm the perfect mom for my kid. And we can tell ourselves that. But what we also need to say is, he's the dad for those kids. Mm-hmm. And so when my husband brings some idea or concept, or maybe he just interrupts our homeschool day in the middle of the day, I had this grand plan and he wants to sweep in and, hey guys, there's a deer outside the window. Come over here and look at it right in the middle of my science lesson. I can't negate that or begrudge that because he's the dad they need too. And just as much as I teach a certain way and I really feel like my kids need the way I teach, they need the way he teaches too. So I can't begrudge him of that.
Yeah. And I think you do have a very interesting situation because most people don't have that with their partners or spouses. And we actually get a lot of pushback, from especially the male partners. So when I do have dads who are in my program, I'm always just like, I wonder what the mom did. And I know the mom got them into it. So I wonder what the mom did to convince them to homeschool. But now they're with it. They're like, yeah, my kid's not going, to school. I work with a lot of people. They travel a lot. They world school, they unschool, they homeschool, they school at home. There's all these different things that they do. But to get your partner on board, sometimes that's like the first battle. First, you have to deal with getting them on board. And then the community with the S word. I don't like the S word either. But it's just, getting them on board. So it's really important. I want to speak to having the support of your partner and your family. I'm sure, was his mother a big help too in the beginning too, when you first got started?
Yes. I mean, she's always such an advocate for homeschooling for sure. But to her credit, she tried not to get into that argument. Like she realized that was not her place. We would work it out and come to conclusions. But I do think that the biggest, I didn't push him into it. I didn't want to be the one to strong arm him because he needed to buy in for himself. He needed to feel like, yes, this is the right way. Otherwise, he would constantly question me, or it just wasn't going to be an easy walk if I had to constantly convince him that this is the right thing. Mm-hmm. So I knew when I started preschool, I knew if he wasn't convinced by kindergarten, she would go to kindergarten. I didn't want to be ununified with my husband. I, as a person of faith, just really prayed about it and said, God, this is what I feel like we need to do, but my husband is not on board. So you either need to change my heart or you need to change his so that we can be unified in this decision. But I think the biggest factor was I just allowed him to share his concerns, and I heard them and I valued them. And I feel like in the last 16 years, I've done the best that I can to understand his fears and to account for them. If he feels like I don't really think that the reading program is going well, well, instead of coming back at him with a snarky remark and judgment and, well, who are you to say I'm the one who does the teaching all day? I validate what he's saying and say, and welcome him in and say, hey, let's find something together that we both can agree on.
I love that. And so what does a typical day look like? I know no day is typical, but what does a day look like for you in your homeschooling journey?
It has changed. Every year it looks a little different because my kids get a little bit older. They mature. Of course, in the early years, it looked different because each year I was adding a new one to the fray. Now, I've graduated one, and I have a senior this year and 2 high schoolers and 1 middle schooler. So for the most part, I feel more like a facilitator now than I ever have before. I feel like I established some good habits and routines in the early years that set them up for lifelong learning. So whether I was there or I wasn't, they knew how to learn. They knew where to find information and how to think critically and to examine sources, and knew where to go to find sources. So I feel like I no longer have to spoon feed the learning.
Okay.
But also I can, in some ways, be a cheerleader for them. For the most part, if you're asking for a schedule, I think that there are some definite benchmarks to our day. Even now, we start out with a morning time together where we all come together in one spot to do a couple things. We focus on some faith building for our Christian worldview. We always listen to a news podcast, and it's like a kids news. It's a highly vetted news, so it's nothing too it's nothing inappropriate for a kid to listen to, but it's sort of distilled. It's the news distilled down for their ears, because I want my kids to be cognizant of current events, be able to articulate their opinions about them, to be able to establish a worldview about certain events. So we listen to the news and we have great conversations about it. And then we read for 15 minutes, including myself. We each pick the book that we're reading and we read silently to ourselves, kind of parallel play on the couch together, just read, because I think that a lot of times homeschooling moms talk about reading and the importance of reading. And they buy lots of books and fill their homes with, yes, books and books and books and books. And every nook and cranny has a book. Yeah. And all of those things are great. But you have to model the readerly life if you want your children to catch the readerly life. What you model, they will follow. So I want my kids to see me reading for the sheer pleasure of reading. I want to make it a line item on the schedule so that they know this time, this pleasure reading is just as important as math. It's just as important as science. So for 15 minutes before we head off in different directions to kind of start our more structured learning, we all sit and we read side by side. I set a timer and everything to make sure that my rear is in the chair and I'm actually not just giving lip service to the importance of reading, that I'm actually reading myself. And then from there, we kind of go our separate ways. I take one child over to do grammar and spelling while the others are doing their own thing. And then I just kind of have a rotation of, it's grammar and spelling time. So when I call you over, that's what we're going to be doing. And they have independent work that they work on. But that's kind of the clip of our day. There's some independent work. There's some work with mom. There's lots of delight-directed learning. I want to leave large swaths of time in the day for them to chase their own passions and dive deeply into those skills. I'm a firm believer that if you look at the intellectuals and innovators throughout history, those people did not know a little bit about everything. They knew everything about one thing.
Yeah.
Need to have lots of time to dive deeply into their own giftings and passions, even maybe at the expense of something that the world would say was super important in school. Yeah.
That's very important. And so we talked a lot about the education piece, but being that your kids are homeschooled, I would like to know how you incorporate things like life skills and community service into your curriculum.
As far as community service goes, for the last, 5, 6, 7 years, we have been serving at a soup kitchen together as a family. I want my children to know what it looks like to serve your community sacrificially. And so we do that once a month on a Saturday together. There are other opportunities to serve. In fact, we serve at our co-op twice a month because my kids are pretty much the set up tear down crew. They've taken that on as a ministry.
Yes.
So they work together to flip the classroom so that they work for a co-op space. We meet at a church. So it's not always conducive to homeschooling, and it needs to be flipped around and changed. Mm-hmm. So we definitely serve, but I like to serve together as a family. And I'm sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Life skills.
Life skills
like cooking, cleaning.
Yes.
Changing the tire.
Yes. And I think that is one of the biggest blessings and benefits of homeschooling is that gets incorporated in a natural, organic way. You know, we're folding laundry in the middle of the school day, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But I also am a little bit intentional in that, and for me, it was kind of easy. I had 5 kids. There's 5 days of the week. So I've always assigned each one of my kids a day of the week, and they are sort of my shadow for that day. So that's the day you are in charge of laundry, and you are mom's sous chef until the time you have done it well enough that now you can cook the whole dinner by yourself. So I can give some focused attention to training in practical life skills to that one child. I've assigned them to a day. And that's not to say that they might not cook on another day, or, you know, if the dog vomits on their bed and they need to wash their sheets, they can't do it any other day, even if it's not their day. Yeah. It's just that I'm intentional and mindful to teach those life skills to that particular child on that particular day.
I like that. And that's something that sometimes we don't really focus on that. It's like we're trying to parent them, be their teacher, be the maid, be the Uber driver, you know, we're wearing all these different hats. And so when I did see your post, you know, dedicating to your daughter, I was like, yeah, I remember those days, you know, trying to wear all those hats. And so since you've been, you know, your husband was homeschooled and you've been homeschooling your 5 children, what advice would you give to new homeschooling parents entering the education?
Trust your child and trust yourself. You know, your homeschool is not going to look like my homeschool, and it shouldn't, because your child is different. Your skills are different. Your budget is different. Your why are you homeschooling is going to be different than mine. So I would just say, put the blinders on to what everybody else is doing, even the homeschooler down the street, even your best friend who is homeschooling. Put the blinders on, put your head down, and faithfully and consistently teach the child that you have, not the child you wish you had, or that the world tells you you'll have, or your friend has. Teach to the child that you have. And I really do think faithfulness and consistency will serve you better than any of the next new shiny thing. You know, I have been guilty of seeing a new curriculum pop up and think, oh, I should get that. You know what? Pretty much every curriculum on the market today is a good curriculum if you just use it faithfully and consistently, you know?
Yeah. And so going back to community, you have the Unlikely Homeschool blog in the Bibliophiles community. They're part of your online presence. How do these platforms help contribute to building a supportive community for homeschooling parents? And what role does community play in your educational approach?
Well, I think with those 2 particular communities, for the most part, the people who kind of hang out in those spaces have a shared vision. It is a faith space, but I think I'm really cognizant to leave room for questions, to leave room for differing opinions. I am always of the mind, if you disagree with me, feel free to say that. As long as you can respond with grace and I can respond with grace, and we can have a dialogue and a discourse and end the day not in a street fight. I think that differing opinions and diversity is always welcome, because that's how people learn. That's how people grow. If we constantly cancel each other and, unfollow, we're just in an echo chamber, basically. And we're just looking for people who will pat us on the back and affirm our already held beliefs. That's not what I want for my children. I want my children to be constantly learning, constantly growing and maturing and being teachable. So I need to be modeling that myself and be teachable too. So I hope that those two spaces, the Unlikely Homeschool and the Bibliophiles, are places where people can have good discourse and end the day agreeing to disagree if necessary.
And so I do want to be able to share your platform with our network. So if you can just tell them where they can follow you, where they can find you, and how they can connect with you.
Probably the best space, kind of the all-in-one space, is jamieerickson.com. That's where you can listen to my podcast and follow my blog and learn more about the Bibliophiles, which is my kidlit vetting community where I vet books for parents who maybe don't have the time or the interest or the skill set to do that, but really want to find clean and captivating books for their kids. That's kind of what I do in the Bibliophiles community. You can read all about that at jamieerickson.com.
I love that. And they can also follow you at unlikely_homeschool as well on Instagram. Yes. And so I just wanted to thank you, Jamie, for taking the time to share with us your experience. I do know it will help a lot of people from all communities. And I just want to thank you again for sharing your journey with us.
I was honored to chat with you. It was a sure delight.
Thank you.